Welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome. Welcome, welcome. Come on in. Comment, let me know you're here. Thank you for joining us again. Let me see your comments. Who's here? Who's on? Hey, Amanda. Hey, Key. Good evening. Good evening. All right. Let's come on in. Please share this. It is going to be great. Especially share so that your cousins and them who still know how to act right might get some help. Because it could be trauma. Okay? Could be trauma. That's the problem. Unresolved trauma. Hey, Alana. Welcome into this space, everyone. Welcome in. Welcome in. Again, please share this. Hey, Teresa. Please share. Hey, Jamia. She's in the house. The tribe is showing up. Good stuff. Good stuff. Hey, Norma Jeannie, I should say. Glad you guys are joining us. I'm not going to wait too much longer for too many more people. Hey, Rebecca. That's my PFF, y'all. She's in the house. I'm not going to wait too much longer because we ran out of time last time. That's how we got to this part 2. So it's 9:01. I'm giving folk to 9:02 to get here because we have too much to cover to be waiting on folk to get in the house. So I suggest you text, you tell folk, come on in, come on in, come on in, because we need to have as much time as we can get to have this conversation. Hey, Pastor Dowling. Hey, Jan. All right, fam is in the house for our speaker, our guest. Yay. All right, so let's do and get started. Welcome to another episode of Tisa's Rants and Musings. I'm so excited that you guys are here and joining with me. Tonight's conversation is Understanding Trauma Part 2. Last week, our minds were blown. We heard so much about trauma that we had never heard before, and especially those of us who worked around social workers in social services, just the way that our guest speaker, who is a licensed therapist, talked about trauma just really ignited for us like so much and just opened our eyes to so much. So we had to bring her back. You guys were like, we need part 2. We need part 2. So we got part 2 here. Kristen is with us. She is going to, I'll let her introduce herself again. And then we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, Kristen.
Hi. How are you? How's everybody doing?
There you go.
I am
Good,
excited
good.
to be back tonight. Very excited. And ready to talk trauma.
Yeah, I think there's a delay. I don't know where it is, but we're just going to keep moving anyway. Maybe it doesn't show up for you, but we're going to keep moving anyway. If you guys see, hey, Jamie, if you guys see a delay, just put it in the comments for me, because I'm not sure what it could be or where it could be generating from. But we are excited you're back. Thank you for sharing your time with us. And just so everyone knows that anybody who comes on, this is pro bono. They're sharing their talents, they're sharing their gifts, to kind of help the healing. Hashtag healing is the only agenda cause move forward in the world. And so let's get right in it. So last time you talked about the neurobiology, if I'm even saying it right, of trauma and how it shows up in our bodies. And you said things like, what being trauma informed helps us do is move from saying what is wrong with that person to what happened to that person. And then so many, out of what you were saying, so many thoughts came up of just how that unresolved trauma plays out in our lives. And so I thought for this Mental Health Awareness Month, that some of the learning we can talk about is just how does it impact relationships? I think of as women who's predominantly my sisterhood, you see them there, right? They're predominantly people who I am in conversation and community with. And we find ourselves in these relationships, whether it's with each other or whether it's with spouses, family members. And I just know that unresolved trauma shows up. But sometimes we don't even recognize it to be such. So we keep wondering if our cousin Baby don't change. And the real reason that cousin Baby not changing is because Baby has so much unresolved trauma. And so we're mad at cousin Baby because she done had the fourth baby, but we haven't talked about what happened to her. Right? We haven't talked about the trauma that cousin Baby may have experienced. We just look at people's lifestyle and we get, we judge them or we get upset with them or their occurring behaviors, and we don't really realize what's at play. So I'm turning it over to you. Take us however you want. Let me say this. Hey, Victoria, you guys, please, if you have questions, because last time we realized we didn't leave any space really for questions, but we want to do that tonight. Hey, Michelle, glad you're able to make it. If you guys have questions, go ahead and put them in the comments, and we can lift them up in the space. So I'm going to turn it to you, Kristen, and you just take us on.
Okay, sounds great. So I think when I think about relationships and how trauma may be impacting them, I think one of the really important things to consider is the neurobiological aspect, right? So people may be familiar with the term fight or flight. And so I wanted to kind of break that down a little bit and expand it. So a trauma-informed perspective really looks at fight, flight, and freeze, right? So the Bible says, right, and we know God's word is true, that we are fearfully and wonderfully made, right? So God was very intentional in the way he designed our bodies and the way he designed our brains, right? So there's a part of our brain called the amygdala, where that's our threat detector system. So when there is a perceived threat, right, that part of our brain is going to signal our body there is danger, and it's going to pump us full of adrenaline and cortisol, right? And so if someone responds in fight, right, that could be trying to physically fight a person off, right, if you're physically being attacked. It could also just mean lashing out verbally. And I think that happens a lot in relationships, right? And so again, as we're talking about trauma, we never want to excuse negative behavior, right? We're not trying to excuse aggression, say it's okay. We are not excusing lashing out, putting people down, right? Abusive behavior, language. But from a trauma perspective, we really want to try to understand what is happening, right? With the goal of then addressing that, right? So if you're the person engaging in those behaviors, that's an opportunity, right? To look at what may be unresolved trauma for you. And if it's happening in a relationship, then you may need to evaluate that relationship, right? Is this person willing to change and deal with their own stuff or not? So that's fight. Then flight is, I'm out of here, right? So there's a perceived threat. I'm going to get away from this as soon as I possibly can. And we can think about that, about situations that we may physically be in danger, but a lot of times this also happens in relationships when someone's trauma is activated, right? So now we hear a lot about the term ghosting, right? Like somebody just disappears, right? That's often related to unresolved trauma. And for some people, if I have an unresolved trauma history and I'm in a relationship, a romantic relationship with somebody who's treating me really well, that's going to feel threatening to me because it's going to feel unfamiliar. And so sometimes even in healthy relationships, people may run, right? And then the third
wait. Okay, because you just said a whole mouthful, and so we got to slow down. Okay, so let me go back to fight.
Okay.
And in relationships. So I'm going to give you an example, and you tell me if that is it, because I could be so off. But when you said it, it made me think of, okay, if someone is saying something or doing something to me in the relationship that makes me feel threatened, that could be a subconscious trigger to when I may have been abused as a child or to some trauma that happened to me. Let's say in my childhood, I go into, I'm ready to fight. And so I respond to, let's say, a verbal assault with ready to go physical because it's a trigger for me. So my initial reaction is to start fighting, and I become aggressive. Would that be okay? Okay.
Absolutely.
And then when you said
a great example, and I think the thing that's important about that is with trauma memories, they're often stored in a very fragmented way. And so that's why our brain is short-circuiting and thinking there's this real danger when really a lot of the things that are triggering people with unresolved trauma, there isn't actually a real threat there, but it feels real to them. Their brain is signaling them, right? And so they're being reminded of an unresolved trauma. It's almost like being transported back in time, right?
Right. Okay.
Intellectually, know this is a different person, but in your brain, right, the way that the memory is stored, your brain is telling you you're in danger. You need to protect yourself. And it might have nothing, like, I think one of the interesting things with trauma is sometimes the person who may be triggering the person isn't even aware they did anything because they could just remind them of the person. I'm thinking of clients that I have who one had been sexually abused as a child and could remember the TV show that was on during her sexual abuse.
Wow.
Anytime that TV show comes on, she's triggered, right?
Wow.
Scent can trigger, right? If there was a scent background during a traumatic experience. If you're in a car accident, right? Car accident is a trauma, and a song on the radio is playing. Just that song can trigger a trauma response. Yeah.
Wow. That's so good. When you talked about flight, it made me think of people who don't stay in relationships long.
Mm-hmm.
or people who run, and it seems like they have relationship after relationship with the same person, but
Mm-hmm.
it never lasts long, or it's just always something. Is that the same thing as flight? That there's usually some triggering that happens, and then they just are out of there. They're not able to deal with it. Like, is that the same thing?
Absolutely. Yes, that would be an example of flight, right? Because again, when we feel we're in danger, our brains are not really thinking logically, right? All your brain power is about making sure you're safe. And so many times people with unresolved trauma, right? Because if we think about the idea that most trauma happens in the context of relationships, right? So
Wow.
relationships themselves are the trigger. And
Wow.
so sometimes people that have been, let's say people who have endured abuse as a child, right? They've never learned healthy ways to negotiate conflict, right? Because part of being in a healthy relationship is you're going to disagree sometimes. You're going to get on each other's nerves sometimes, right? So
Right.
we don't want to run at the first sign of conflict. We want to try to be able to work things through, be able to have healthy communication. But those are things that often people with unresolved trauma just don't have those skills.
Wow, wow. And I want to say to those that are commenting, thank you. Thank you for your transparency and putting out there what you experienced. And I'll highlight it and we can always speak to it. So then tell us about the freeze part. What does that look like in relationships?
Yeah. So freeze is the other thing that can happen when somebody is experiencing a trauma trigger. And it's literally just feeling paralyzed, right? And so, again, it can be when somebody is feeling like they're in physical danger and they just freeze up. But a lot of times it's really happening more, and it'll show up in relationships as somebody who often is themselves, right? And so they're not able to articulate their thoughts, their feelings, and they can become very much dependent on other people's approval, right? I don't want to rock the boat. I don't want to cause a problem, right? Many trauma survivors feel that they are to blame for the trauma that they've endured.
Wow.
So freeze can also just look like, it's almost like I'm just disengaging. It's not flight where I'm out of the relationship, but I'm just kind of detaching and kind of going into myself in the relationship. And this can occur in all relationships. It can occur in family relationships, in friendships, in romantic relationships, coworker, supervisor, any relationship really.
Wow. Okay. Okay. So what do we do? Like when you're in these relationships or you're in relationships, and all of us are in some form of relationships, are there
Mm-hmm.
ways of figuring out if some of our reactions and responses are as a result of some unresolved trauma? Like, do we need a therapist to help us figure that out, or can we start looking at behaviors and start doing some self-reflection to think
Mm-hmm.
about, is this a pattern, or is it from trauma, or is this a traumatic reaction?
Right. That's a great question. I always think the best place to start is with self-reflection, right? We talked a little bit last week about how most of us don't slow down enough to even think about what we're thinking, what we're feeling, what's happening internally in our bodies, right? We just go from activity to activity to activity, right? Now it's Zoom call to Zoom call, right? You're exhausted at the end of the day, right? If you're raising children, you're also schooling them. And right, we just live oftentimes in this constant state of exhaustion. So I think the first place to start is self-reflection. And so I think one thing to think about when you're being brave enough to do that is when we slow down enough to self-reflect, you can potentially feel worse, right? You're going to be thinking about, you're going to be feeling and getting in touch with painful emotions, right? And then we might be, right, when we sit with the feelings, well, am I connecting this feeling with anything, right? What's going on? And for some of us, we have just detached from the trauma that happened in our past. And so even going back and being able to process through some of that and think about the impact that it had on us, right? I'm not saying it's essential. Every person that has a trauma history has to go to therapy, right? But I will say therapy is a very safe and non-judgmental place where you can have somebody who's professionally trained to help you process through the trauma, be able to make sense of the trauma. I feel like something I'm constantly saying in sessions, even with adults I have, whether they've experienced trauma as a child or an adult, is what you're doing in relationships, it makes sense given your history, right? I'm not saying it's the best choice, but it makes sense. This is your default, right? It's part of that trauma residue, that this is what you learned, right? If I'm working with somebody who's 45 years old and this is what she's done for 45 years, it's going to take work to unlearn those thoughts and learn new ways of thinking. And literally talk therapy and learning to think differently literally changes your brain structure. So it literally, just doing the work in therapy can help people make different connections. So some of those connections that were formed in trauma, those connections in our brain weaken, and we can literally choose to think differently. And I think journaling can also really help people with that as well. For people who maybe you're not ready to start therapy yet, or you're not sure if you need therapy, I think committing to a practice of journaling a few times a week, even for 10 or 15 minutes, and just kind of seeing what comes up, I think is a good place to start.
We got a good question here that is related to when we're looking for a therapist. Do you need to consider someone who's the same religion as you are? And I think it's a very good one, because you often hear that you have to, one, seek a therapist who is religious, but then one that must be of your same religion. What do you think is the best way to approach it?
So I think that's a great question. And I think it really depends on each individual person, right? A lot of times for trauma survivors, one of the things that's happened is your power has been taken away from you, right? And a lot of trauma survivors may even doubt their ability to make good decisions for themselves. And so I think really knowing and taking charge of your own healing journey, right? And that ultimately what I believe is you know what's best for you, right? So any good therapist, right, for me as a Christian, right, I'm obviously the most well-versed in Christianity, but I've worked with Muslim clients. I've worked with clients who are Jehovah's Witnesses. So any good therapist is going to welcome their client's spirituality into the session. And I have some Christian clients that, you know, that's not really a focus of the session. I have other Christian clients that really want a Christian therapist because they want somebody that knows the word. They want to bring the word into the session. They want to open up in prayer. So it really just depends on each individual's needs and what you think is going to most benefit you.
We got some good questions coming in. You guys keep them coming. Are you ever too old to change your brain structure? And then Jamie followed up with, too old or too damaged?
That is a great question.
Isn't it? That is a great question.
Yes.
Think of, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, right? You kind of get that in your mind that after a certain age that there's no hope. That's just who you are. That's you've been through too much to change.
Right, right. Absolutely. No, those are great questions. So the answer to the first question is no, you are never too old, right? And you are not too damaged. Now, I'm assuming that the question is really related to the way trauma has impacted their brain, right? Obviously, if somebody has a traumatic brain injury, right, that's something that would be separate. But absolutely, you are never too old. There is not too much damage. It's never too late. There's a concept called neuroplasticity, and that really means that our brains continue to be malleable throughout life. And so when we think about the word, right, and God talking about be transformed by the renewing of your mind, right? It's amazing that this was written so many years ago, but it still holds true today, that literally by changing the way you think, right? And thought work is hard work, right? Because a lot of our thoughts aren't even necessarily conscious. We're reacting based on them, but they're not even conscious. But that idea that you can learn new ways of thinking, and you can also learn skills to help you relax your body, right? You can learn skills in therapy. We call them distress tolerance skills. So how do you learn to tolerate distressing feelings? How do you learn to regulate your emotions? And all of those things will ultimately help with changing brain structure.
Wow. And I love that you bring in the word, right? That be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and how it's still relevant today, and how God even back then put into our bodies this capability to be transformed, this capacity, I should say, for healing, that we don't have to stay broken. We don't have to stay damaged. We don't have to stay in a space where we have this trauma residue on us, right? But that we can be renewed, that He has that space for us, that ability for us is there. Can you talk a little bit more? Last time you talked a lot, or I shouldn't say a lot, you mentioned a lot about trauma residue, but we didn't get to really get in it as to what does that totally means, and I guess it's connected to that question of being able to see it, being able to start now putting the dots together in our behaviors. I remember there was a time in my life I knew I had a pattern of behavior, but I didn't quite understand why. Why was I responding this way? I knew when I felt rejected, I responded fiercely, right? I started to recognize the pattern that somebody can say something, I feel rejected or condescended upon, and now I have this aggressive reaction. And it took some time for me to realize, like, why are you so angry that that person doesn't want to be your friend? Why are you so angry that that person won't let you into their circle? When you're growing up, these things happen. And, being a pastor's daughter, I used to run into a lot of that, where, oh, don't let her into the circle. But it would make me so angry. There was something about rejection that was so triggering of aggression, because then I really wanted to fight. You from Brooklyn, I was the fight of the fight freeze. And not that I was ever a violent person. It just was like, I just felt aggression. Like I felt this anger and this, even if they tried years later to want to be friends with me, it was no, I remember when. So it's like, so how do you start to put those patterns together? Connecting those dots, that some of this behavior and reactions that I'm having is because there's this trauma residue, that this and it's not a normal reaction to want to be at that level, that height of anger and aggression, just because somebody said something that you might have even misinterpreted.
Right. Yeah. So I think in terms of trauma residue, one of the major ways that it impacts people really is in our thoughts. And so there's a concept that I think is important for people to understand, and that's a concept called core beliefs, right? So core beliefs are really these beliefs that we internalize about ourselves, right? And about relationships, about the world in general. Most of those core beliefs develop in our family of origin, or the family that we grew up in. But we can also have various traumatic experiences throughout our life, right, that could also fuel those core beliefs, right? So if somebody grows up in a family where there's healthy communication, right, a child feels safe, right, then they're going to internalize positive core beliefs, right? I am loved, I am safe, I am worthy, right? And so core beliefs, sometimes it's based on what's explicitly communicated, and other times it's just these implied communications, right? Based on the family dynamic, or even based on a look that a parent can give, right? So examples of negative core beliefs that can originate from trauma are things like, I'm misunderstood, I'm powerless, I'm not good enough, people I love will leave me, right? I'm a disappointment. And the list can just go on and on. If I express myself, bad things will happen. And so I think one of the things to recognize, very common. So I think one of the important things to think about is sometimes when we're noticing a reaction, it's really just about what's happening on the surface, right? And there's nothing else to it, right? So for example, somebody that gets really frustrated when they're stuck in traffic, right? Even as a therapist, I'm not trying to like look at some deeper meaning to being frustrated by traffic, right? But what you're describing, right? Like I'm having these really intense reactions that appear to be an overreaction. That's often a signal something deeper is being triggered in me. And it's usually people's core beliefs. So if people just Google core beliefs, right, you can find lists of core beliefs. And I think that can be a great place for people to just start noticing when I'm having these intense reactions, right, whether I'm lashing out or not, what is happening internally for me? What is being triggered, right? So it can happen just even in simple situations, right? If your boss meets with you for a performance review and they glowing, right? And here's one area to improve on. Yes. And you have this reaction, right? That's usually because you already have the underlying core belief of I'm not good enough or I'm a disappointment, right? Because somebody with wrong self-concept, you can hear that exactly as your boss is saying it, right? No, like they're highlighting all the great things you're doing. But somebody with unresolved trauma is going to hear it and perceive it in a different way because they're perceiving it through their trauma lens. And that's really what they know. And so by identifying the core beliefs, that's how we can create replacement beliefs that somebody's going to practice. For Christians, that can include the word. So many of my Christian clients, part of the replacement beliefs that they're creating are literally scripture. And that's what they're repeating to themselves, right? And that can be even more powerful, right? When we think about the power of applying scripture to our life.
Okay. But wait.
I was going to go on to something else.
Huh?
I said I was going to say something about guilt and shame, but you look like you wanted to say something first. So go ahead.
Hold it, because I don't think we can go past this part that you said, how
Okay.
Because I can remember the day how you can get so many accolades. You can get a performance appraisal that has a million things beautiful on it. And then there's that one thing, and I have seen even with staff that I have, and you get a paragraph back as to why that one feedback is not accurate. I have seen people
Yeah.
refuse to sign their performance appraisal because there was one thing on it that they felt wasn't accurate, or they wanted to defend that one thing. And I'm like, but that's such a minor uh, feedback. Like, and I said all of this other beautiful stuff. Why is that so? And it's almost comes across as so you really don't have the capacity to receive feedback.
Right.
And
Right.
I see it all the time, and I just wonder. I mean, and I hate to put it in this way, but I wonder even sometimes, as women of color, is you get a barrage of negativity sometimes so much, and it's all subconscious that everything that even can be good feedback to you comes across as someone hating, or comes across as someone just don't, they're jealous, and all this stuff that you hear that sometimes could be this trauma residue, impeding our ability to hear feedback that could really help us.
Yes. Right. Because if I think I'm damaged and I'm not good enough, right, I'm dismissing certain feedback, right? And I'm just hyper focusing on that one thing because I'm being triggered, right? So again, it's nothing that the boss is doing, right? This is my own trigger. And one of the awesome things about recognizing that is when I recognize it's my own trigger, I can fix it. Right? I can't fix or change anybody else's behavior, right? And a lot of times trauma survivors may be trying to do that, right? Well, I can change this person. I can fix them. I'm going to be the one, right? And I think that's an important lesson to learn early on when we cannot change anybody else. And we are not responsible for anybody else's behavior, only our own work.
I think this question that Victoria has about how can one break the cycle is something you're even just talking about, where it's being able to recognize that these are your own triggers. I've told people before that, when it's happening in multiple places in your life, that's a sign that maybe it's something to look at, right? If you're having difficulty hearing feedback from your spouse, difficulty hearing feedback from your children, difficulty hearing feedback from your boss. Like no one can tell you anything without there being this major uproar, and they're either being disrespectful or they're jealous or there's something wrong with them for giving you feedback. That's a sign that maybe it's not the people around you, it's you. And that doesn't mean that their feedback is accurate. What it means is your reaction to the feedback is a trigger to say that maybe you have difficulty with feedback because of some trauma residue. Yes. But then what you just said is so powerful. Then you can recognize, though, then if it's my trigger, I can work from that. Wow, that's very powerful. Oh, Alana has a good point that she put up there. Sometimes I feel like people are attacking me rather than looking at it as a feedback to improve. And I think that's something many of us have struggled with.
Right. Well, right. And I think that's part of the importance of the self-reflection piece, because there are also going to be times in an interaction when somebody's behavior has nothing to do with you and everything to do with their unresolved trauma. But that's the importance of the self-awareness piece. Is this mine, right? Is this mine to own? And if it is, okay. If this is, I've self-reflected, I know I didn't do anything wrong, then it's being able to say, okay, that's that person's unresolved stuff. It's not mine. And again, I think those things are real at work, right? Where sometimes there are supervisors who are power trippers and have their own issues and may be acting out, right? A lot of the clients of color that I work with, right? We are talking about racism in the workplace, right? So like that's real as well. And if we're thinking about racism as a trauma, right? Just figuring out how to navigate those things. So, there's so many layers to these things that sometimes we can't just give a like, okay, this is what it is. But that's why it's important to look at and process all the different layers. And again, to always start with yourself. What am I bringing to this interaction?
Yeah, I think that's so good. It's so powerful. It's putting the power back in your hands to say, I'm going to take the power and I'm going to self-reflect. I'm going to look at what could be my triggers. I'm going to look at how trauma might be showing up for me. But then I'm not just going to look at it. I'm going to now work on that healing. And part of that healing and moving forward is being able to admit that these are possibly some trauma reactions, that we do have unresolved trauma that could be getting in the way of our having healthy relationships, even if it's with a power tripping manager, because it's still a part of that is how you respond, right? And so I just think to kind of close us out, when we start talking about the healing process, and you mentioned some things like journaling, which, I know it's been around for a while. It's good to get your feelings out, to be able to write them. You talked about self-reflecting, going to counseling, that we put like as number one. I think everyone, and these days, most jobs will offer you at least 8 free sessions if you go through the EAP program on the job, which should be confidential. And you get to, I remember using it to find a good counselor. I had 8 different tries to see if this is someone I wanted to stick with without having to pay for it. So you get, utilize the services at your hands. But sometimes we also let things like finances stop us, as if because we say we can't afford it, when the truth is we really can't afford not to anymore. Being broken and unhealthy is causing us so much in our lives that it's like we just can't afford to do it. We have a good question here from Rebecca. How can you tell your child has experienced trauma when the parent doesn't have any firsthand knowledge? Is there differentiation in the signs and symptoms our children may experience from adults? That's a great question.
So how can you tell your child has experienced trauma? So it's a parent that's wondering, does my child have a trauma that I don't know about?
Right.
That's the question.
And are there some symptoms that I can look at that might be different than adult symptoms of trauma? But how would we know?
So, I mean, obviously, depending on the age, right, I think it's important for parents to directly ask questions. So if you have a concern that something may have happened, I think it is important to try to create, a safe, non-judgmental place to ask questions. But obviously we know with childhood trauma, right, especially if we're thinking about sexual abuse, there are often threats made to the child, right? If you tell anybody, I will kill your family members, I'll kill you. So I think creating a supportive space is important. In terms of symptoms, some of the symptoms are going to look different from adults. In children with trauma, you may see bedwetting, and bedwetting that's like not age appropriate, right? Because some kids might just wet the bed, but for a child who isn't bedwetting and now they start bedwetting again, that's a very common sign of abuse. A heightened startle response where the child is very easily startled can be one. You also want to pay attention with children to their artwork. So drawings, even their play, because if I'm working with, let's say, a 7-year-old, right? I'm not going to sit and talk with a 7-year-old, hey, let's just process all your trauma. When I've done play therapy with children, we actually don't even have to necessarily talk about the trauma. Kids have like this natural healing process that can happen through play and art, but looking for, again, for children with sexual trauma, if their play is really sexualized or their behavior is sexualized, or there's a lot of violence in the play. So those are just some examples of things to look for. And I would also, maybe if you trust the school, right, check in with a child's teacher, like, hey, have you noticed anything out of the ordinary? Because teachers should be trained to be looking for things like, and again, some kids fall through the cracks because it may be more withdrawn behavior. They may, be really social, and now they're just kind of withdrawn. Yeah. And I know we're running out of time. Can I just say one other thing? Just related to So, because I do feel like this is important in terms of breaking the cycle and also trauma residue, is learning to label what you're feeling is important. And a feeling that I want to say is really universal with trauma survivors to varying degrees is shame. And a lot of times we don't label shame, right? We say we're sad, we say we're hurt, we say we're disappointed, we may feel guilty, but I think it's really important to differentiate guilt and shame, right? Yes. So guilt is a healthy emotion, right? There's no such thing as a bad or negative feeling, right? Feelings are teachers, right? They're here to show us something, like that. And for us to be able to locate what's happening, right? So that's why learning to tune into what you're feeling is so important. So guilt, and if we think about it from the Christian perspective, right, the Holy Spirit is going to convict us, right? Not to make us feel bad, right? It's really, hey, get back on track, right? So guilt, people often feel, and the thought associated with that is, I did something bad, right? And that guilt will often help us correct behavior. So shame is really more about who you are. And so the thought that often goes with shame is, I am bad. I am damaged. Something's wrong with me. So I think another really important thing in terms of breaking the cycle is recognizing when you're in shame and really being able to self-talk. No, I am not bad. Maybe I made a bad choice, or maybe something that happened to me was bad. But as a person, right, I am not bad. I am not permanently damaged. And so I think shame is actually part of what keeps people stuck in these cycles, because it's like this really powerful, like shame will cause people to go into their shell. I don't want to tell anybody what I'm struggling with, right? I've done these things. I don't want anybody to know. And so we walk around carrying this shame. And I think the analogy that I'll often use is, it's like a backpack versus having a carry-on bag, right? If I have my shame in a backpack, it's weighing me down, but I can't locate it. I can't see it, but it's there, and there's this heaviness that I'm carrying every day. If I have the carry-on bag and I'm wheeling it, it's in my hand. I can see it, I can locate it, and that's really when I can do something about it.
I love that. That was, like Monika said, a gem that you just dropped there. that the difference between the backpack. Now say it again, the backpack and
versus like your carry-on bag, right? If you're carrying on like a carry-on bag at the airport, right? Either like you have it over your shoulder, so you're holding it, or you're literally taking it with you, right? And I think a carry-on bag is also like you're controlling how it's maneuvering, right? Like, okay, I can see this, I know what it is. I'm now in control of it versus it's just there and it's playing out and it's impacting all my relationships and I'm not even recognizing it's the shame that's getting in the way of my relationships.
And we've gone over time, but I think this is just so worth it. It's so worth it. We may need a part 3. You guys stay tuned. This is too good, and it's free help. Okay, so we're gonna soak up as much as we can for free, and after this, we should be able to get on that track of healing with a counselor and all that. But this has just been so awesome, and what I was going to say is how many times we see people who seem to have so much pride, right? We say, okay, this person is not going to be able to apologize. They don't apologize. They don't do these things. They're so prideful. But really, if we look at it deeper, it probably, or could be, you tell me, is that shame figure or feeling that is causing them to not be able to admit that they're wrong, not be able to admit that they've done something wrong, because that admission triggers that shame in them.
Absolutely. So often people that do feel like I always have to be right, they often are carrying shame.
Wow.
Absolutely.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Professor Miller.
You are so welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yes,
for having me.
Absolutely fantastic. I hope you guys have appreciated these nuggets, these gems. Again, please share this on your page so that we can start this healing together, because we need to be healed. We need to be made whole. And again, it is our right as believers to be made whole. Is our right and privilege as children of God to be whole. And he came that we have life and have it abundantly. And what gets in the way oftentimes is this unresolved trauma that we have in our lives and this trauma residue. So knowing is half the battle. And thank you, Kristen, for allowing us to learn from you and to glean from you about how we can start approaching this healing process and getting on the healing journey. Why? Because healing is the only agenda.
Only agenda.
Yes. If you haven't connected with me, please connect with me on TJ Nance Ministries on Facebook. If you share this with people who want to see it and join in next week with us, they don't have to friend me. They can go to the ministry page and see the live on the ministry page, and they can see it when it goes live then. Thank you guys so much. This was so awesome. Please know that you are able to be healed. There's no damage that God can heal us from. There's nothing that's happened in our lives that has to keep us hostage. We can be healed and we can move on. And I'm here for it. Are you guys here for it? Yes. Thank you. Tune in next week. I'll put out there, because I got to talk to Kristen again. I might have to beg her to just do one last one, because I'm still interested in how trauma shows up in the church. Okay. But, we may not want to go there. But I'm just saying, we might need to talk about unresolved trauma and how it shows up in leadership, right? And how it shows up in clergy, and how it shows up when we take on leadership positions, and how we see it in institutions such as our churches, right? Such as our houses of worship, because sometimes we're engaging with each other and we have all of this church hurt happening. And some of that church hurt is happening because we have hurt people hurting people, and then we're taking it to other hurt people. So how do we start to deal with the trauma that might be even showing up in church? Jamia says, go there. Okay. Says, amen. Okay. Nikisha's like, right, we need one more. We want one more. She might bill me after this. Okay, guys, have a good night. I love you. There's nothing you can do about it. Come back next week. Remember that Kristen's counseling center is called Mosaic Counseling. I have put her information on our page If you want to reach out, she has counselors and therapists. You don't have to go to her directly. She has trained people working for her. So definitely reach out. And even as I mentioned before, use the EAP on your job if you need to. But listen, you can't afford it anymore. We can't afford to stay broken anymore. We just can't, especially as the sisterhood. I love you. Take care. Bye. Thank you, Kristen.